The purpose of the Institute is to explore the relevance of the work of Ernest Becker to death and dying and working with people who are dealing with those issues. And that was originally the inspiration of Herbert Anderson, who you'll hear from a little later. And of course tonight you'll hear from our main speaker, Dr. Sherwin Nuland, on how people are dying now and how medicine interacts with that reality. The previous institutes have been on topics like spirituality, death and care, finitude, medical futility and care of the dying. Tonight the institute this year is finitude and the faithful care of the dying is our institute topic. By now, I think most of you are aware of the work of Ernest Becker. Ernest Becker was an anthropologist who, using many different approaches to the human condition, arrived at a synthesis of understanding humanity and the human dilemma, the dilemma that we face and the dilemma that we cause for ourselves. And his analysis, which is very complex, boiled down to something simple, that we are the one creature that we know of who can become aware of our own finitude and of our personal death, and that this has really unique implications for humanity in our day-to-day functioning, in the way we live our lives, in the way we run our societies. So that will be the work that we'll have being applied tonight and throughout our 3 days. We're here at the University of Washington because the University of Washington Department of Psychiatry is one of the co-sponsors for this event and for the Institute, as is the Psycho-Oncology Department of Swedish Cancer Institute and the Washington State Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, who are co-sponsors for the event. And we've been lucky to have the University of Washington host many of our events in the past. But tonight I'm going to ask John Wynn to introduce Herbert Anderson. But initially what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about John Wynn. John Wynn is a psychiatrist who is currently a clinical professor here at the University of Washington. He's also the head of psycho-oncology at Swedish Cancer Institute here in Seattle. He's a psychotherapist. He's a wonderful speaker. We'll only hear from him shortly tonight. And he's also very interested and involved in leadership and how leadership affects organizations and can be improved in organizations. So John, I'd like to ask you to come forward and introduce Herbert Anderson, who will introduce our speaker.
We're going to do a cascade introduction this evening. So, Herbert Anderson really, to many of you, requires no introduction. He is the father of the Summer Institute program, and it was his brainstorming with Neil Elgee that really led to the creation of this biennial program. He's currently research professor in practical theology at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Let me know if I get this wrong. And his wife has told us that they have two sacred texts in their home, the Bible and the denial of death. It's pretty impressive. He was a parish pastor and a hospital chaplain, and then became, one of the deities that walks amongst us, and we're grateful to have him here. Thank you very much.
We don't want to take any more time away from Sherwin Nuland. I have just this afternoon met Sherwin Nuland, but I have known him for about 15 years, as I have used his book, How We Die, in teaching classes on dying and grieving. Students initially scream and holler because it's too painful to read, and then they write notes of gratitude for not only the fierce honesty with which Dr. Nuland writes about the dying, but the compassion with which he writes. I know how his grandmother, Baba, died, And I know about the struggles with his brother's death and friends like Janet and Rick whose struggles. We know a lot of his friends and a lot about Dr. Sherwin Nuland in his book. But most of all, I want to just tell you a very brief story which I heard him tell in 2005 at Yale. The last speaker at this conference was Margaret Farley, and Margaret Farley was being honored as she was retiring, and Sherwin Nuland gave this wonderful testimony. And he said that he talked about how she used to arrive. She was a nun. In those days, she would arrive in full habit, and she wouldn't say much to the medical ethics gatherings at Yale. And then when she spoke, everybody listened. And he would go home and tell his wife about this nun who would come and be silent and speak, and everybody listened. And after a while, his wife said to Sherwin, "You know, Sherwin, I think you're in love with this nun." And there was this wonderful pause as he told the story, and he said, "You're probably right. You too, I believe, will be in love with this man when he's done. Thank you very much for coming to be with us."
Fear nothing, I have a wristwatch to tell me when to stop. I know I'm in Seattle, but I'm from the Northeast, so I wear a coat and a tie. Do all of those things. This is really an extraordinary privilege. I'm so grateful to Neil and to Herb Anderson for inviting me. I love this city. I've only been here 3 or 4 times, but every time I come, I'm reminded of what a gorgeous place it is. We had the most amazing talk at dinner. Just a bunch of guys talking about the human spirit and biblical theology and who knows what. Come have dinner with us tomorrow. I invite all of you. Herb was kind enough to talk about the book, How We Die, that changed my life in the early 90s from being a busy surgeon in a busy university community to suddenly being proclaimed an oracle on the subject of death, which I didn't realize I had spent my life thinking about and actually planning to write this book until after I had written it. And let me tell you what I mean. I was born in an immigrant family, and the legend of the family was about my grandfather and 2 uncles who came from a small village in what is now Belarus and who developed tuberculosis in the early 20th century, as so many immigrants did on the Lower East Side, and died before my grandmother and the girls in the family could come over. One of those girls died in childbirth. Another of those girls died in her 30s of Bright's disease. I had a brother who was stillborn. I had another brother who died at the age of 3. Death, without my really acknowledging it, was in the legend and lore of my family. And my mother died of colon cancer when I was 11 after a very prolonged course. And I realized, looking back on it, obviously, that this is what drove me to medicine. It wasn't the fear of death. It was having control over disease. If I were to become a doctor, I could stop the disease that had decimated my family over the course of 3 generations. And so there I was. I went into a surgical residency, developed the usual busy surgical practice. I'd been at it for about 35 years, and one day my secretary not one of the nurses, my secretary walked into the examining room where I was just finishing up a physical examination of a new patient, and she whispered in my ear, secretary, they never walk into examining rooms. They're not supposed to do that. She whispered in my ear, there's a phone call, I think you'll want to take this. And I said, who's it from? She said, the magic words, she said, it's a literary agent. Well, I had written a book on the history of medicine, and so I had a little bit of taste of the writing life and how much fun it can be. And I finished the examination. I was actually near the very end. I mean, it was literally near the end. I was at the end. I was doing the rectal exam. So I slipped out, and I slipped out of the room, and I went to speak to this fellow on the phone who introduced himself to me, and he said that he had an idea for a book, an original idea. And he had been speaking to some editors in New York, and they knew about some of the previous writing I'd done, and then my name kept coming up, and he said, I thought I'd try you. What is the book to be about? He said, do you know that there is no book, either for the medical profession or for the laity, that actually talks about the details of how people die of coronary disease, cancer, old age, dementia, whatever? And I said, there must be lots of such books. That was our first conversation. He said, well, try me just over the next couple of days, visit some libraries. And I did. I went to the Yale Medical Library, nothing for students, nothing for house officers or faculty. And of course, in the New Haven Public Libraries, it was the same thing. So lo and behold, there was really nothing available. And here we were, near the beginning of the hospice movement, near the beginning of the growth of bioethics, the beginning, only the beginning of the awareness of how badly we treat people at the end of life. And yet, if you wanted to know what actually happens to someone with long-standing malignancy, there was no way to find out what that person feels, what his or her doctors feel, what they go through physically, but also emotionally, primarily physically, though there wasn't any such thing. So I took him up on it, and I wrote this book. It took me exactly a year. I took a year's leave of absence, and it took me 365 days. I never spoke to him for the whole. He had no idea what I was going to do with this book, and neither did I. But I found to my astonishment that the book wrote itself. It came off the end of my Eberhard Faber 2.5 pencil. I write on double-line stationery. I shouldn't say double line. I write on every other line. Double-line stationery is what they give you in Hebrew school, which is how I first learned to do that. But I have one of these things. You see, it's close to a nubbin now because I was working on the plane. And I wrote it out that way, and when it was published, it was barely edited. Something in my unconscious mind had told me what I should write. And when I came to the chapter on old age, and this is a story I've told a number of times, and I don't want ever to forget it, I realized and remembered that for the first 17 years of my life, I had been living with a woman who was dying of old age. She died at 97, my grandmother, who we called Bubba in the Eastern European way. And I watched that slow deterioration, and I remember distinctly, my wife was at home at that time. I walked into the kitchen and I said, you know, I'm writing about old age, and I want to write about my Bubba, but who will care about a 4-foot, 10-inch woman who couldn't speak a word of English, who had no idea what this culture was all about? Who can identify with such a person? And she said 3 words to me. She said, don't censor yourself. Just write what you think needs to be written. Well, I didn't think. It was all, again, out of the unconscious, and I wrote that chapter. And an astonishing thing happened after the book came out. You know, you get a lot of letters about a book, and one of the letters came from a man named Jim Barnes, who described himself as a pig farmer in Iowa.